The fall of Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973 was not a sudden collapse triggered by a single coup, but the endpoint of a slow, grinding confrontation between democratic socialism and Cold War power politics. As Chile became one of the most consequential testing grounds for whether a nation could pursue radical economic and social transformation through electoral means without being crushed by forces far larger than itself, because when Allende assumed the presidency in 1970, he did so not as a revolutionary who seized power by force, but as a Marxist elected through constitutional process in one of Latin America's oldest democracies, a fact that immediately unsettled Washington and polarized Chilean society, as his victory challenged a core assumption of the Cold War, that socialism could only advance through coercion, subversion, or external imposition. Allende's popular unity government set out to remake Chile's economy by nationalizing key industries, redistributing land, expanding social services, and asserting state control over resources long dominated by foreign corporations and domestic elites, most notably the copper industry, whose profits flowed disproportionately to American companies and whose nationalization struck at the heart of U.S. economic interests in the region. These policies were framed by Allende and his supporters as a peaceful road to socialism, grounded in legality and popular mandate. Yet they unfolded within a global system that treated ideological deviation as a strategic threat, especially in the Western Hemisphere, where the Monroe Doctrine and decades of intervention had conditioned American policymakers to view leftist movements as unacceptable risks to regional stability and U.S. influence. From the moment of Allende's election, the United States moved to contain and undermine his government, not primarily through overt military action, but through economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and covert operations designed to exploit Chile's internal divisions, a strategy justified in Washington as necessary to prevent the establishment of a socialist model that might inspire similar movements elsewhere in Latin America. Internal documents and later investigations would reveal that U.S. officials sought to make the Chilean economy scream, restricting access to credit, pressuring international institutions, and signaling to investors that Chile was an unsafe environment for capital, actions that compounded existing economic challenges and intensified shortages, inflation, and social unrest. These external pressures interacted with domestic opposition that was already fierce, as Chile's business community, conservative parties, and segments of the middle class viewed Allende's reforms as an existential threat to property rights, social order, and political pluralism. While within the Popular Unity Coalition itself, disagreements over pace, strategy, and compromise undermined coherence and made governance increasingly difficult. The Chilean military, long regarded as professional and apolitical, became a focal point of tension, as both supporters and opponents of the government recognized that ultimate power would rest with the armed forces should constitutional mechanisms fail, and efforts to influence military leadership intensified as the political crisis deepened. Throughout 1971 and 1972, Chile entered a spiral of polarization in which strikes, demonstrations, and counter-demonstrations paralyzed daily life, most notably the truckers' strike that disrupted distribution networks and symbolized the breakdown of cooperation between state and private sectors. While media outlets aligned with different factions amplified fear and mistrust, creating an atmosphere in which compromise was increasingly portrayed as betrayal. Allende attempted to navigate this environment through negotiation and institutional restraint, seeking agreements with opposition parties and repeatedly affirming his commitment to constitutionalism. Yet these gestures failed to arrest the erosion of legitimacy as each side interpreted the other's actions as proof of bad faith. Within the Cold War context, Chile's crisis was not merely a domestic struggle, but a proxy battleground over whether democratic socialism could coexist with U.S. hegemony, a question that resonated deeply after the Cuban Revolution had closed off peaceful paths to radical change and hardened American resolve to prevent another perceived loss in the hemisphere. The Soviet Union, while supportive of Allende rhetorically and to a limited extent materially, approached Chile with caution, unwilling to invest the resources or assume the risks required to offset U.S. pressure, leaving the Chilean experiment isolated within a hostile international environment and underscoring the asymmetry of power that defined Cold War politics outside the superpower core. As the economy deteriorated and political institutions strained, violence began to creep into the margins of Chilean life, with clashes between militants, sporadic acts of sabotage, and growing talk of armed confrontation, further undermining confidence in peaceful resolution. By 1973, the government faced a hostile Congress, an increasingly oppositional judiciary, and a military leadership under mounting pressure to intervene, as sectors of society concluded that constitutional order itself was collapsing. The election of March 1973, which saw the Popular Unity Coalition retain significant support despite economic hardship, failed to resolve the impasse, instead reinforcing the sense that neither side could decisively defeat the other through electoral means, intensifying the temptation to seek extra-constitutional solutions. In this atmosphere, the Cold War logic of zero-sum competition exerted its full force, as compromise was framed as capitulation and coexistence as an illusion, pushing Chile toward a moment of rupture that would reverberate far beyond its borders. The fall of Allende thus began not on the morning of the coup, but years earlier, in the collision between democratic ambition and a global system that punished ideological deviation, setting in motion a chain of events in which internal polarization, economic warfare, and covert intervention converged to place one small nation at the center of a struggle over the limits of democracy in the Cold War world. As 1973 unfolded, Chile's crisis accelerated toward a breaking point, driven by a convergence of economic paralysis, institutional deadlock, and mounting pressure on the armed forces to resolve a conflict that civilian politics no longer seemed capable of containing, because the mechanisms that had once allowed Chilean democracy to absorb ideological difference were now overwhelmed by a Cold War environment that treated moderation as weakness and compromise as surrender. Inflation surged as shortages deepened, production fell, and daily life became defined by queues, rationing, and uncertainty, conditions that eroded support for the government among sectors that had initially welcomed reform but now feared instability more than inequality. While opposition leaders framed the economic breakdown as proof that socialism and democracy were incompatible, these hardships were not solely the product of policy missteps or external pressure, but of their interaction, as nationalization and price controls collided with capital flight, credit restrictions, and deliberate disruption, creating a self-reinforcing cycle in which each attempt to stabilize the economy generated new resistance and deepened mistrust. Within Congress, opposition parties used their majority to block legislation, impeach ministers, and signal that the executive had lost legitimacy, while Allende's supporters accused the legislature of sabotage and obstruction, transforming institutional checks and balances into weapons of political warfare. The judiciary increasingly intervened against government actions, issuing rulings that constrained reforms and reinforced the perception that the state itself was divided against its elected leadership, a fragmentation that undermined confidence in constitutional solutions. The military, once peripheral to political life, became the silent arbiter of the crisis, as officers were drawn into civilian disputes through requests to restore order during strikes and demonstrations, blurring the line between neutrality and intervention. Allende attempted to preserve civilian control by appointing military figures to his cabinet in moments of acute crisis, a strategy intended to reassure opponents and stabilize the situation, but one that also normalized the armed forces' presence in governance and accustomed officers to viewing themselves as guardians of national order rather than servants of elected authority. Within the officer corps, attitudes toward the government hardened unevenly, as some remained committed to constitutionalism, while others came to believe that intervention was necessary to prevent civil war or economic collapse. Perceptions reinforced by media narratives and by contacts with opposition figures who portrayed the government as a threat to the republic itself. Covert activity intensified during this period, as U.S. intelligence efforts focused on gathering information, maintaining contact with opposition groups, and signaling support for forces seeking to remove Allende, even as official policy avoided overt endorsement of a coup to preserve plausible deniability and limit diplomatic fallout. This shadow campaign operated within a broader strategy of pressure rather than direct command, exploiting Chile's vulnerabilities rather than dictating outcomes. Yet its presence contributed to an atmosphere in which conspiracies flourished and trust evaporated. The Popular Unity Coalition fractured under the strain, as disagreements over whether to accelerate revolutionary measures or seek compromise with the center deepened divisions, weakening the government's ability to present a unified strategy and convincing opponents that paralysis would only intensify. Street politics grew increasingly confrontational, with armed groups on both left and right preparing for violence, stockpiling weapons, and rehearsing scenarios of confrontation, feeding a sense that Chile was sliding toward civil conflict, even as most citizens yearned for stability. The June 1973 attempted coup, known as the Tanquetazo, provided a stark preview of what lay ahead, as a rebellious armored unit attacked government buildings in Santiago before being suppressed, exposing the fragility of civilian control and revealing how close the military already was to overt intervention. Although the failed uprising temporarily rallied support for constitutional order and prompted Allende to reshuffle military leadership, it also convinced many officers that the taboo against intervention had been broken, lowering psychological barriers and accelerating plotting. Opposition leaders interpreted the episode as evidence that the armed forces were prepared to act, while government supporters saw it as proof of imminent threat, further polarizing society and narrowing the space for negotiation. International attention intensified as Chile's crisis came to symbolize the broader Cold War struggle over democracy and socialism, with observers on the left viewing Allende as a martyr in waiting, and critics depicting his government as a cautionary tale of ideological excess, narratives that stripped the situation of nuance and reinforced zero-sum thinking. As August approached, institutional collapse appeared imminent, with Congress passing resolutions accusing the executive of constitutional violations and calling on the military to restore order. Language that opponents interpreted as a mandate for intervention and supporters condemned as an invitation to dictatorship. Allende responded by reaffirming his commitment to legality and calling for a plebiscite to break the impasse, a proposal that reflected his enduring faith in democratic process, but arrived too late to reverse momentum, as conspirators judged that delay would only complicate their plans. Within the armed forces, coordination among commanders intensified, as shared fears of chaos and external encouragement coalesced into a consensus that action was necessary, even as doubts lingered about legitimacy and consequence. The Cold War context magnified these decisions, as officers understood that intervention would be welcomed by Washington and tolerated by much of the international system, while failure to act risked isolation, economic collapse, and potential radicalization. By early September 1973, the convergence of internal polarization, economic warfare, institutional deadlock, and covert encouragement had produced a moment in which the removal of an elected government appeared, to its opponents, not as a rupture of order, but as its restoration, setting the stage for the final act of Chile's democratic experiment and exposing how Cold War logic could transform crisis into justification for authoritarianism. The final descent toward the coup unfolded with an eerie sense of inevitability, as the forces converging against Salvador Allende moved from calculation to execution in a political environment where legality had been hollowed out by fear and polarization, and where the Cold War had reduced Chile's democratic experiment to a strategic problem to be solved, rather than a process to be defended. In the days leading up to September 11, 1973, military coordination intensified quietly but decisively, as senior officers across the Army, Navy, Air Force, and police aligned around a plan that framed intervention not as a seizure of power, but as a necessary act to save the nation from collapse, a narrative that would later be institutionalized to legitimize repression. General Augusto Pinochet, recently appointed commander-in-chief of the Army, emerged as a central figure in this process, not initially as an ideological zealot, but as a cautious opportunist whose loyalty to constitutional order had eroded under pressure from peers, political signals, and the perception that hesitation risked disorder and marginalization. The convergence of military leadership around the coup was facilitated by months of normalization, as repeated calls for intervention, cabinet appointments, and emergency deployments had accustomed officers to exercising political judgment, blurring distinctions between obedience and guardianship. International signals reinforced this trajectory, as the absence of meaningful diplomatic consequences for intervention, combined with the expectation of rapid recognition and economic support from Western powers, reduced perceived costs and encouraged decisive action. On the morning of the coup, the illusion of institutional balance collapsed completely as naval units seized control of Valparaiso, communications were cut, and coordinated movements unfolded across the country with precision that reflected extensive planning rather than spontaneous reaction. In Santiago, tanks moved through the streets as Air Force jets prepared to strike La Moneda Palace, transforming the capital into a theater of military dominance and psychological shock designed to overwhelm resistance before it could organize. Allende, informed of the uprising and urged to flee or negotiate, chose to remain in the presidential palace, issuing a final radio address that affirmed his commitment to democracy and refused to legitimize the overthrow, a moment that would later be mythologized, but which at the time underscored the isolation of a leader who had exhausted institutional avenues. The assault on La Moneda, culminating in aerial bombardment and infantry advance, marked the violent end of Chile's constitutional experiment as the state turned its weapons inward against its own elected authority, a spectacle that reverberated globally as evidence of how far the Cold War had penetrated domestic politics. Allende's death inside the palace, under circumstances that would be debated for decades, became a symbol of both personal resolve and systemic failure, as democratic process proved unable to withstand the combined pressures of internal division and external hostility. In the immediate aftermath, the military junta moved swiftly to consolidate control, dissolving Congress, suspending the Constitution, banning political parties, and declaring a state of siege that transformed Chile overnight from a contested democracy into a militarized state. Repression followed with ruthless efficiency as thousands were detained, tortured, exiled, or killed, and stadiums were converted into detention centers, revealing that the coup was not merely corrective, but transformative, aimed at dismantling the social and political foundations of the Popular Unity Project. The Cold War logic that had justified intervention now structured the regime itself, as dissent was framed as subversion, opposition as treason, and security as an absolute value overriding all claims to rights or representation. Internationally, reactions reflected the same asymmetries that had shaped the crisis, with condemnation from some quarters outweighed by rapid normalization and support from governments that viewed the new regime as a stabilizing force and a bulwark against socialism, reinforcing the lesson that alignment, not legitimacy, determined acceptance in the Cold War order. The United States moved quickly to re-engage economically and diplomatically, while distancing itself rhetorically from the coup's brutality, a posture that encapsulated the contradiction of condemning excesses while benefiting from outcomes, and that underscored how strategic priorities eclipsed democratic principles. The Soviet Union denounced the overthrow, but lacked leverage to reverse it, its limited engagement before the coup now highlighting the vulnerability of movements that challenged U.S. dominance without equivalent backing. Within Chile, the coup reshaped society through fear and restructuring, as neoliberal economic reforms were imposed alongside political repression, binding market transformation to authoritarian control and embedding the consequences of Cold War intervention into everyday life. The fall of Allende thus revealed the full cost of attempting democratic socialism within a polarized global system, demonstrating that electoral legitimacy offered no shield when ideological stakes were defined as existential, and that the Cold War's demand for alignment could override even the most entrenched democratic traditions. This moment did not merely end a government, but redefined the limits of political possibility across Latin America, sending a signal that deviation from accepted economic and ideological paths would be met with force, a message reinforced by subsequent interventions and dictatorships. The coup in Chile became both precedent and warning, illustrating how internal crisis could be accelerated by external pressure into irreversible rupture, and how the Cold War transformed national politics into sites of global struggle where the fate of democracy itself depended less on ballots than on the tolerance of dominant powers. The aftermath of the coup revealed that the fall of Allende was not an aberration confined to Chile, but part of a broader Cold War pattern in which democratic processes were subordinated to strategic imperatives, as the consolidation of the Pinochet regime unfolded with international acquiescence that confirmed the asymmetry of moral concern in a bipolar world. In the weeks and months following September 11th, 1973, Chile was transformed into a laboratory of authoritarian control, where repression was systematic rather than reactive, designed to eliminate not only armed resistance, but the social networks, unions, parties, and cultural institutions that had sustained democratic pluralism, reflecting a deliberate effort to reorder society in ways that would prevent any future challenge to the new order. The junta's narrative framed this repression as a necessary purge to restore stability and economic health, language that resonated with Cold War rhetoric, portraying dissent as infiltration and reform as subversion, enabling the regime to justify extraordinary violence under the banner of national security. This framing was reinforced by external validation, as Western governments normalized relations, reopened lines of credit, and encouraged investment, signaling that political legitimacy could be reconstructed through alignment and market reform rather than popular consent. The introduction of sweeping neoliberal policies, guided by technocrats trained abroad, marked a sharp departure from Chile's previous developmental model, embedding economic transformation within an authoritarian framework that insulated decision-making from democratic accountability and tied prosperity to compliance. These reforms were lauded by supporters as evidence that the coup had rescued Chile from economic chaos, while critics pointed to the social costs borne by workers, the poor, and those excluded from political life, a debate that mirrored Cold War arguments over whether stability justified repression. Beyond Chile's borders, the coup sent shockwaves through Latin America, reinforcing a climate in which militaries increasingly viewed themselves as arbiters of national destiny and guardians against ideological contamination, a mindset that would underpin a wave of dictatorships across the region. Coordination among authoritarian regimes intensified through networks of intelligence sharing and repression, most notoriously Operation Condor, which extended the reach of state violence across borders and demonstrated how Cold War security doctrines could transnationalize terror under the guise of counter-subversion. The United States' posture toward these developments reflected a prioritization of containment over democratic values, as policymakers weighed human rights concerns against the perceived necessity of preventing leftist movements from gaining power, a calculation that institutionalized selective outrage and normalized complicity. This approach was not monolithic, as debates within Washington revealed tensions between strategic pragmatism and moral responsibility. Yet the prevailing outcome consistently favored stability over democracy when the two appeared to conflict. For the global left, Chile became a symbol of betrayal and warning, illustrating the limits of peaceful transformation in a system that treated socialism as inherently illegitimate regardless of method, and prompting reassessment of strategy among movements that had looked to Allende as proof that electoral paths were viable. For the right, the coup was often framed as confirmation that decisive action was necessary to prevent chaos, reinforcing narratives that equated order with authority and portrayed pluralism as a weakness to be exploited by adversaries. The international response to Allende's fall thus revealed how the Cold War structured moral judgment, elevating alignment above process and outcome above legitimacy, and how democratic erosion could be justified when it served broader strategic goals. Within Chile, resistance persisted under conditions of fear, as exile, clandestine organization, and cultural expression became means of preserving memory and dissent, demonstrating that authoritarian control, however brutal, could not fully extinguish the demand for representation and justice. The long duration of the dictatorship underscored the durability of regimes born of Cold War intervention, as external support, internal repression, and economic restructuring combined to entrench power and delay accountability. When Chile eventually returned to civilian rule, it did so under constraints shaped by the coup's legacy, including constitutional provisions and institutional arrangements designed to limit popular sovereignty and protect military prerogatives, illustrating how the consequences of intervention could outlast the Cold War itself. The fall of Allende, therefore, stands not only as a national tragedy, but as a case study in how global systems shape local outcomes, revealing that democracy's survival depends not solely on internal consensus, but on the willingness of powerful actors to tolerate alternative paths. In this sense, Chile's experience exposed the central contradiction of the Cold War, that a struggle framed as a defense of freedom repeatedly undermined freedom, where it conflicted with strategic interest, leaving behind societies marked by trauma, inequality, and unresolved memory. The legacy of 1973 endures as a reminder that the Cold War was not an abstract rivalry fought at summits and missile sites, but a lived condition imposed on nations whose political experiments were judged not on their democratic legitimacy, but on their conformity to an unforgiving global order. The longer historical reckoning with the fall of Allende reveals how Chile became one of the clearest demonstrations of the Cold War's capacity to narrow political imagination, as the destruction of a constitutional socialist experiment reshaped not only national trajectories, but global assumptions about what forms of democracy were considered acceptable within the international system. In the years that followed the coup, Chile's experience was absorbed into Cold War doctrine as both cautionary tale and validation, interpreted by some as proof that radical reform inevitably led to chaos, and by others as evidence that democratic pathways to socialism would be crushed regardless of legality, reinforcing polarized narratives that left little room for nuance or alternative models. This distortion mattered because it influenced policy far beyond Latin America, hardening attitudes toward reform movements in Africa, Asia, and Europe, where leaders contemplating non-aligned or socialist paths were forced to calculate not only domestic feasibility, but external tolerance. Knowing that deviation from accepted economic and ideological frameworks could invite destabilization. The Chilean case thus functioned as a silent warning embedded in diplomatic practice, shaping decisions through fear rather than explicit threat, and demonstrating how the Cold War enforced conformity without always requiring direct intervention. Within academic, political, and activist circles, Allende's fall prompted intense debate over agency and responsibility, as scholars examined the interplay between internal polarization and external pressure, challenging simplistic explanations that blamed either foreign interference or domestic mismanagement alone, and instead revealing a complex system in which structural constraints, ideological rigidity, and strategic calculation interacted to produce collapse. These debates underscored a critical insight that democratic resilience cannot be measured solely by institutional design or electoral legitimacy, but must account for the broader international environment in which democracy operates, an environment that during the Cold War often proved hostile to experiments that threatened dominant interests. The gradual declassification of documents in subsequent decades deepened this understanding, exposing the extent to which economic pressure, covert action, and diplomatic signaling were employed to shape outcomes while maintaining plausible deniability and reinforcing the perception that Chile's fate was influenced as much by global strategy as by local conflict. Yet even as evidence accumulated, accountability remained elusive, as the Cold War's end did not automatically produce justice for its victims, leaving societies to grapple with legacies of violence and compromise in isolation. Chile's transition back to democracy illustrated the enduring constraints imposed by authoritarian restructuring, as negotiated settlements preserved elements of the old order in exchange for stability, revealing how the aftermath of intervention can shape political possibility long after the original crisis has passed. This pattern was not unique to Chile, but repeated across regions where Cold War interventions left behind institutional legacies that constrained democratic choice and normalized inequality, linking the fate of individual nations to a broader global history of imposed limits. The fall of Allende therefore occupies a central place in Cold War memory, not because it resolved ideological debate, but because it exposed the fragility of democracy under systemic pressure, demonstrating that elections alone could not protect political projects deemed unacceptable by dominant powers. Its lesson resonates beyond its historical moment, warning that global systems continue to shape the boundaries of acceptable politics, even in the absence of overt ideological confrontation, and that sovereignty remains contingent when power is unevenly distributed. The Chilean tragedy reminds us that the Cold War's most lasting impact may lie not in the wars it fought directly, but in the possibilities it foreclosed, narrowing the range of futures available to societies that sought to chart independent paths. In this sense, Allende's fall stands as a symbol of the Cold War's quiet violence, inflicted not only through bombs and bullets, but through the systematic erosion of political alternatives, a legacy that endures wherever external power continues to define what forms of democracy are permitted to survive. The final significance of the fall of Allende lies not only in the overthrow of a single government, but in the exposure of how the Cold War operated as a system that disciplined political possibility, enforcing boundaries through pressure, fear, and example rather than through constant overt force. And in doing so, redefining what democracy itself could mean in a world structured by ideological rivalry. Chile's experience demonstrated that even long-standing democratic institutions could be rendered fragile when global power dynamics aligned against them, and that constitutional legitimacy offered little protection once a political project was framed as a strategic threat rather than a domestic choice. The coup of 1973 revealed how internal polarization, economic strain, and institutional deadlock could be accelerated by external intervention into a point of rupture, transforming crisis into justification and dissent into treason, and how quickly a narrative of national salvation could legitimize repression when endorsed, or at least tolerated, by powerful allies. For the Cold War as a whole, Chile became a defining lesson in the limits of tolerance, showing that while the superpowers proclaimed competing visions of freedom and progress, both operated within a framework that privileged control over pluralism and stability over experimentation, leaving little room for alternative paths that challenged prevailing economic or ideological norms. The destruction of Allende's peaceful road to socialism resonated far beyond Latin America, influencing how reform movements were perceived and how states calculated risk, embedding a lesson that democracy alone was insufficient if it produced outcomes that conflicted with dominant interests. This lesson did not require constant reinforcement, because the memory of 1973 functioned as a deterrent in itself, shaping choices through anticipation rather than action, and narrowing the horizon of political imagination across much of the developing world. Within Chile, the legacy of the coup endured through decades of authoritarian rule and constrained transition as trauma, exile, and silence became part of national life, and as the structures imposed under dictatorship continued to shape politics even after formal democracy was restored, illustrating how Cold War interventions could outlast the Cold War itself. Globally, the case of Chile forces a reconsideration of how democracy is defended and undermined, revealing that its survival depends not only on internal commitment, but on external tolerance, and that international systems can be as decisive as domestic institutions in determining political outcomes. The fall of Allende thus stands as one of the Cold War's most sobering episodes, a moment when the promise of democratic choice collided with the realities of power, and when the language of freedom was reconciled with the practice of coercion. Its enduring warning is that global orders shape local futures, and that when ideological rivalry hardens into zero-sum thinking, the space for peaceful transformation shrinks rapidly, leaving societies to choose between conformity and confrontation. In this sense, Chile's tragedy is not confined to its past, but speaks to a broader pattern in which the limits of democracy are set not only by ballots and constitutions, but by the willingness of the powerful to accept outcomes they do not control. A lesson as relevant beyond the Cold War as it was within it, and one that continues to challenge assumptions about sovereignty, legitimacy, and the true cost of maintaining order in an unequal world.